Game Freak is one of the most well-known and successful video game development studios in the world. They're the creators of Pokémon, the highest-grossing media franchise in history. But this wasn't always the case. Once upon a time, a couple of kids with a passion for gaming had a dream. This is the story of Game Freak. Ken Sugimori was born January 27, 1966 on the island of Kyushu, in Fukuoka's downtown Hakata district. He was a lonely kid growing up. His father's job in television required the Sugimori family to move often. As a result, Ken was constantly having to switch schools and had a hard time making friends. But he would use his art skills and love of manga as an icebreaker. He would draw manga in the margins of his notebooks during class, and even had a group of artist friends that would take turns drawing a page and passing the book around until they had a full 16-page story. Ken still keeps those stories and treasures them to this day. All of this led him to one realization, that he was destined to become a professional manga artist, or mangaka. As Ken entered his teen years in the early 80s, there was another craze sweeping Japan: the arcade, and Sugimori was swept in. Now living in Tokyo, he walked into a magazine shop one day and happened upon an amateur, homemade video game fan magazine called Game Freak. Ken instantly fell in love with the fanzine. He felt the only thing lacking was quality illustrations. There was no way to screenshot games back then, so all the pictures were drawn by the book's creator, a kid named Satoshi Tajiri. Ken wrote to Satoshi, including some of his illustrations, and saying he'd like to make the artwork for Game Freak. Satoshi wrote back, saying welcome aboard. The two exchanged letters until one day Satoshi invited Ken to go to an arcade trade show with him. The event was for industry insiders only. Satoshi had made it onto the list because of his expensive hobby of collecting arcade circuit boards, and he had gotten a ticket for Ken. Because the show was taking place on a school day, Ken would have to play hooky in order to attend. He told his parents he was going to school, but instead ditched his school clothes in a train station locker and met Satoshi at the show. Satoshi Tajiri was born in a suburb of Tokyo called Machida on August 28, 1965. As a child, he loved exploring the natural habitats around his home and was fascinated by insects. So much so that other kids called him Dr. Bug. But as the natural landscape he would explore as a child became overrun by apartment buildings and shopping centers, Satoshi's interest would shift to the exploding arcade scene of the late 70s. While attending school, Satoshi would often skip class and spend his days at the arcade. He became obsessed with one game in particular, Space Invaders. At the time, the game was so immensely popular it had produced countless knockoffs and clones, and Satoshi played them all. He spent so much time playing the game at his favorite arcade that they even gave him his own Space Invaders cabinet to take home. I was really into Space Invaders in about 1978. It got me more and more interested in video games. There wasn't any media to get information about games, so I came up with Game Freak magazine. Satoshi Tajiri. In 1983, Satoshi decided he wanted to share his extensive knowledge of video games with other gamers. And thus, Game Freak was born. The name was based on a nickname for the rabid Japanese arcade fans of the 80s, and its first issue would feature Taizo Hori from Dig Dug on the cover, published in 1983. It was that very issue that Ken Sugimori would happen to find in a random magazine stand in Tokyo. In 1984, Ken graduated from college and moved into a small apartment in Machida, so he could be closer to Satoshi. The two would turn the cramped apartment into the original Game Freak office and continue publishing the magazine, which, thanks in part to Ken's art, had acquired a cult fan base. They were producing some of the world's first strategy guides, with a readership in the thousands. The magazine would eventually go from being handwritten by Satoshi to being professionally printed. As the success of Game Freak grew, Satoshi was becoming more interested in the idea of making games himself. The more I learned about games, the more frustrated I became because the games weren't very good. I could tell a good game from a bad game. My conclusion was, let's make our own games. Satoshi Tajiri. A meeting with Xevious creator Masanobu Endo would seal his decision and the fate of Game Freak as a company. Satoshi began his path toward making games by first disassembling Nintendo Famicom systems to see how they worked. He then spent the next 2 years learning the Famicom's Family Basic programming language. In 1989, Game Freak published its first game. a tile-based puzzle game called Quinty. Namco had agreed to publish the game, and it would end up a success for the new studio, selling 200,000 copies. During this time, Ken was drawing a monthly 2-page manga tie-in for the game, but wasn't able to pursue his dreams of becoming a full-time manga artist with the workload he was dealing with at Game Freak. Their follow-up to Quinty was going to be an idea Satoshi had been cooking up for a while. He wanted to create a game that would replicate that feeling he had as a child of catching and collecting bugs. He felt the spread of urban areas throughout Japan had taken away so many of its natural habitats for catching bugs, and this was his way of preserving his favorite childhood pastime for other children to experience. While playing Dragon Quest II one day, Satoshi and Ken would happen upon an idea that would set their new game apart from anything else on the market. While playing the game, Ken came into possession of 2 rare hats. Satoshi wished there was some way for Ken to give him the extra hat, and thus the idea of trading between games was born. The original design document for Capsule Monsters showed a fantasy world with over 200 monsters, who could be captured, collected, battled, and traded via a link cable. Satoshi pitched the idea to Nintendo, who at first were not sure about the concept, but did agree to give him some initial funding as well as the guidance of Super Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto. Originally, the team's development time for the game was going to be 6 months, but as ideas for the game continued to expand, they realized that deadline would never be reached. Not only did the team run out of time, they also blew through all of their funding. They would have to work on other Nintendo properties in order to make some extra revenue to put towards the development of Capsule Monsters. The first of these games would release on December 14, 1991 in Japan on both the Game Boy and Famicom consoles. It was another puzzle game, this time starring the familiar green dinosaur from the Super Mario series, Yoshi. The game was another successful one for Game Freak, selling 500,000 copies on its first day. They would release another game around the same time for the Super Famicom console called Jerry Boy, which won Sugimori an award for character design. Ken would also draw a manga for the game. In 1992, Ken directed his first game, Magical Terutokuen for the Sega Mega Drive, based on a popular manga of the same name. They would go on to produce 3 more games in the next few years, Mario and Wario, Nontanta Isho, Kuru Kuru Puzzle, and Pulse Man, the latter of which saw Ken's return to the director's chair. After finally earning enough money to continue work on Capsule Monsters, the team would dive headfirst into development. The name Capsule Monsters had proven tricky to copyright, so Satoshi switched to simply Capomon, before eventually changing the name to Pocket Monsters. But the development process of Pocket Monsters would not be an easy one. A serious time crunch and grueling hours would lead all 3 programmers on the game to quit on the same day. If it wasn't for one man stepping up and vowing to learn programming to get the game done, this may have been the end of Pokemon altogether. Junichi Masuda was born on January 12, 1968 in the Kanagawa Prefecture, located in the real-life Kanto region of Japan. As a teenager, he had a love for classical music, as well as video games and programming. His interest in technology would soon turn into a hobby when he took apart a synthesizer to see how it worked. That kick-started something in me. When I was older, I'd visit Tokyo's electronics district, Akihabara, and buy parts to make my own effects. I also started dabbling in programming at that time. Junichi Masuda. As a child, his family would often vacation in Kyushu, the island which would eventually become the basis for the Hoenn region in the Pokemon world. While there, he enjoyed fishing and collecting bugs, a hobby which he shared with Tajiri. After a mutual friend introduced Junichi and Satoshi, the two would hit it off and become fast friends. In 1989, Satoshi would ask Junichi to join Game Freak and produce the soundtrack for their first game, Quinty. Every day after work, we'd meet up to work on the music, often through the night. When we finished the game, we decided we should probably set up an actual company. That's how Game Freak started. Junichi Masuda. At this time, Ken Sugimori was not officially an employee of Game Freak, although he was pretty much the art director on Pocket Monsters, and was still planning on becoming a professional mangaka. But development of Pokemon was turning out to be much more difficult than predicted, and Ken knew if he didn't stick it out, his friend's dream would likely never be realized. And so, Ken would put off his manga career and join Game Freak full-time to help finish the game. The team would acquire some new programmers and artists, all of whom would contribute to the designs of the original 151 Pocket Monsters. All the staff members, about 10 people at the time, came up with ideas for Pokemon. Everyone had their positions: programmers, graphic designers, planners, etc., but everyone pitched in and helped out on pretty much every aspect of the game. Pokemon's made up of ideas from every staff member. Ken Sugimori. This included Shigeki Morimoto, who designed the iconic battle system for the game, whose core mechanics remain mostly unchanged to this day. He also designed multiple Pokemon, including the 151st entry in the original Pokédex, Mew. We put Mew in right at the very end. The cartridge was really full, and there wasn't room for much more on there. Then the debug features, which weren't going to be included in the final version of the game, were removed, creating a minuscule 300 bytes of free space. So we thought that we could slot Mew in there. What we did would be unthinkable nowadays. Shigeki Morimoto. Another new member of the team was artist Atsuko Nishida, who was brought in to design some cute characters, as cute was admittedly not Ken's strong suit. She ended up creating some of the series' most beloved monsters, including Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander. I created the designs for Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle by working backward from their final forms. I wanted people to be surprised when it evolved into Charizard, so I designed the original Charmander in such a way that Charizard would be unimaginable. Atsuko Nishida. Atsuko also designed the most iconic Pokemon of all, the electricity-powered yellow mascot of the series, Pikachu. Since it was an electric-type Pokemon, I thought Pika, an expression for light flashing in Japanese. For Chew, the squeak sound a mouse makes in Japanese, I wasn't thinking of a mouse but rather chose it because it sounded good, and also because of its size. So I combined several different elements to come up with its name. Pikachu is not particularly mouse-shaped, and a mouse Pokemon named Rattata already existed, so I actually hadn't intended to make it a mouse. Atsuko Nishida. Once initial concept art for all monsters was completed, Ken revised all of the team's designs and created final versions of each of them in his signature watercolor style. During the development of Pokemon, Game Freak nearly went bankrupt on several occasions, had multiple staff members quit, and almost lost all of their hard work due to computer crashes. It was a difficult time, but I never thought about giving up or throwing it all away. You know, when we started work on the game, our motivation was never to make money. We just wanted to make the games we were interested in. Junichi Masuda. But by pulling constant all-nighters and putting literally everything they had into development, the team would realize their dream. On February 27, 1996, over half a decade after Sugimori sketched the very first monster, Pocket Monsters Red and Green versions would release on the Game Boy in Japan. The dual version concept was conceived to capitalize on and foster the trading aspect of the game, with version-exclusive monsters in each. After a slow start, word of mouth and playground rumors of a secret 151st monster would gradually build an audience of rabid Pokemaniacs. The game would shatter sales expectations and go on to sell nearly 50 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling game of all time when it was released. I never thought it'd be this huge thing, or dreamed someday it'd be an anime, or there'd be a movie. Ken Sugimori. When I was making Pokemon, I never thought it would turn into such a huge hit. At the time, I didn't see anyone playing on Game Boy anymore, and it had lost a lot of its popularity. I was at the barbershop once and someone asked, "So you're making a game? What kind of game?" When I told them it's for the Game Boy, this guy I didn't even know said, "The Game Boy? You're a bit late on that one." Satoshi Tajiri. Atsuko Nishida would continue to create many more Pokemon over the years, but left Game Freak to become a freelancer. Shigeki Morimoto is still working at Game Freak as a game designer and programmer. Junichi Masuda would go on to direct most of the mainline series, up until 2022, when he was appointed Chief Creative Fellow at the Pokemon Company. Ken Sugimori is still working at Game Freak, mostly as a supervisor. He never became a mangaka. Satoshi Tajiri is still the president of Game Freak, but has dropped out of the public eye, choosing to live a more private life since the 90s. What started as a fan magazine by a kid with a love for video games became one of the most successful video game companies of all time. And the dream of Satoshi Tajiri and his friends would change the world forever. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the 15th channel for more videos like this, and hit the notification bell to make sure to be notified whenever we release a new one. Thanks for watching. and stay tuned.